I'm going to introduce our first panel. It is already a very eclectic panel. So we're going to start with a presentation by Belinda Mandelbaum. Belinda has joined us from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, where she works both as a practicing psychoanalyst, trained in two different institutions in Sao Paulo, a kind of more radical psychoanalytic institution that's split away from the International Psychoanalytic Association's own training, and then back again into a more traditional training. So she's double trained in psychoanalysis, which is also masochist, clearly. But she's also a professor of social psychology in a very interesting department that is linked with our department of psychosocial studies, because really they're doing psychosocial studies as far as we're concerned. That is, they're continuing a very real engagement with psychoanalysis, which is something that social psychology in this country has pretty much let go of. So we're very delighted she's here, and she's going to talk with us about one of the research projects that she's involved in, which involves a collaboration with a filmmaker. So I'm going to let her do that, and then I'm going to I think we'll introduce the whole panel. Is that good? Then we're joined by Valerie Walkerdine, who's a professor in Cardiff. She's a very important figure in critical psychology, in psychosocial studies, and in the social sciences more generally, I would say. Many of her books are, the first one actually written with Kathy, but very seminal works in terms of a critical thinking about subjectivity, about the psychosocial, about the relationship between psychoanalysis and psychology, has worked on numerous different research projects, recently wrote a book about, another very famous book on growing up girls, so lots of work on gender and sexuality, and a book more recently on the role of video and technology in young people's lives. More recently, if I'm right, Valerie, you've been working with performance.
I have.
Yeah, so we've got a very interesting then intersection. I'm hoping it will come through her talk on performance and social science research. And then finally, I'm very delighted to introduce Jennifer Wakefield, who's a child and adolescent psychotherapist at the Tavistock Clinic, and also works at what's now called First Step, is that right? Which is the Haringey looked after child and adolescent mental health service. So somebody very much working in the NHS and working with young people and their families from a psychoanalytic perspective, but is again someone whose PhD work was on therapeutic observation of an infant in foster care, so has really worked at this intersection between research practice, infant observation and psychoanalysis in relation to the particular setting of foster care, and has written in the edited book that Kathy and Julian Sternberg put together on infant observation and research practices, as well as writing on other issues to do with psychoanalysis with looked after children and infant observation more generally. So that's our panel for the first bit of the morning. So Belinda, do you want to take it?
Well, good morning. Thanks so much for this invitation to be here. I liked so much to listen to Lisa and Simon, especially about this bit on discomfort, because I have to add my discomfort about language as well. I speak a Portuguese, English, and I hope you understand each other. On the other hand, I felt very much comfortable thinking, because when I was first invited by Lisa, I thought, well, I don't know if it's a longitudinal research, but of what you both have said, I think we have much to dialogue today. So I'm very happy to show this bit of work, that it's a working process, and with a lots of questions. And basic part of these questions having to do with this interdisciplinary work, because this is a work I'm doing with two filmmakers and a photographer. It's my first experience in the field. So maybe I hope we might have some thoughts about it here as well. So this is the title of the work. I read a little bit, as it's mainly based on visual issues. There will be some visual material here, okay? The issue of family space, especially the space of a home, has been researched and reflected about through the viewpoint of several fields of knowledge. Historians show how domestic spaces change through time based on the changes in the family conceptions and relationships within the family itself, as well as in the world that surrounds it and that prevails at each different moment and site. Anthropologists find in the domestic spaces and the ways of inhabiting them important hints on the cultural life of different groups. Psychoanalysts, particularly those that are devoted to working with families, find in the space inhabited by families significant hints on the structure of relationships that, whether consciously or unconsciously, organize family life, its patterns of internal relationships and those with the outside world, and their peculiar ways of accounting for the emotional experiences of its members. Thus, the home is deemed to be a sort of a psychic symptom or a form for the resolution of family conflicts, as is in this space happens the circulation of its members, approximations and distances among them, and it's also within home that the history of the family group is either kept, hidden, or recovered. Therefore, the family space plays a central role in maintaining the culture and the psychic life of the group. So the present project investigates the relationships between families and their spaces in a multidisciplinary way, that is, by taking into account historical, cultural, and psychological aspects of these relationships through the way they play out in a specific context, that of the small town of Sao Luiz de Paraitinga at 170 kilometers from the city of São Paulo. A strong reason which led to our interest for working in this place is that it brings together a group of families that have a long history of cultural living and sharing in the community, especially through material and immaterial artifacts and events, mainly related to music and festivals. And it's really a community that struggles for preservation over time. The heritage of this city, nowadays a national heritage, is the historic and cultural heritage of those who live there, and which becomes concrete in the spaces of their constructions, the houses and the streets through which they organize and where they deposit their family histories, including religious parties, carnival, and musical events. With a little more than 12,000 inhabitants between the urban and the rural population, São Luiz do Paraitinga brings together within the town's perimeter, the largest preserved architectonic colonial heritage of the state of São Paulo, in a set made up of large colonial houses, church squares of rare harmony and beauty, a living scenario for the cultural and social activities of the community. In this atmosphere of regional poetry and musicality, many of the inhabitants are artists as well. In São Luiz do Paraitinga, transmission between generations is marked by the musical culture. A link between the state of Minas Gerais, which is a very important state in the colonial period of the country, where there were the mines of gold and so on. So it was a link, this little town, between Minas Gerais, general mines, and the sea, São Luiz do Paraitinga, because the river Paraitinga cuts through the city to form a large river, Paraíba, used to be a passage point for merchandise for the trade flow of gold and spices from colonial Brazil to the world abroad. I might leave you a site about this town if you want it afterwards. In January 2010, it's been broadly disseminated through the media the material destruction which took then place in the town due to strong rainfalls, which brought down constructions, transforming the streets during weeks into spaces invaded by water, which dragged with it everything it found before it: furniture, clothes, objects, toys, that which the daily spaces of houses and of a town are made of. Family spaces were destroyed, disappearing under the wrath of the water, and presently the town faces a long recovery process to regain its lost legacy. So I ask you for your patience. I brought a 5 minutes movie was made by the filmmaker, and it was the kind of a start of this project. Okay?
adolescente, né? Então, a igreja caiu, mexeu com o ego, o autoestima de todo mundo. Não interessa quem tem mais, quem tem menos. A verdade é essa. Caiu a igreja, símbolo, na adolescência.
Mas quando abaixou a árvore que viu isso, 3 meses no mínimo para começar a entrar no.
Mas você não tem um número de gente que faleceu nas. Não teve. Cadê os?
Fazer o quê, né? Fazer a poeira, levantar e.
O principal o problema é juntar com o chapéu, com o outro, que junta em 3, de 3 vira 1. Mas...
Em caso de dor, ponha G, mude o corte do cabelo. Vá ao cinema, dê um sorriso, ainda que amarelo. Esqueça seu cotovelo. Se amargo for já ter sido, troque já esse vestido. Troque padrão do tecido. Saia do sério, deixe os critérios, siga todos os sentidos. Faça fazer sentido. A cada 1000 lágrimas sai um milagre. Em caso de tristeza, vire a mesa com uma só a sobremesa, com uma somente a cereja. Jogue para cima, faça a cena, cante as rimas de um poema. Sofra apenas, viva apenas, sendo só fissura ou loucura. Quem sabe casando cura, ninguém sabe o que procura. Faça uma novena, reze um terço. A cada 1000 lágrimas sai um milagre. Mas se apesar de banal chorar for inevitável, sinta o gosto do sal, do sal, sal. Sinta o gosto do sal, gota a gota, uma a uma, 2, 3, 10, 100 mil lágrimas. Sinta o milagre. A cada 1000 lágrimas sai um milagre. A cada 1000 lágrimas sai um milagre. A cada 1000 lágrimas. A
the music is beautiful and it repeats every 1,000 tears, lágrimas.
Yeah.
There is a miracle, and in Portuguese, lágrima and milagre counts as spelling change. So Freud says in Mourning and Melancholy that during losses, aspects of our affective experience with the lost object manifest themselves in a rather clear way. Along with such objects go parts of ourselves, the history of our relationships with them. What is that the water takes away, and what remains? How is it possible after destruction to rebuild lost spaces, inhabiting them once again with objects that are both useful and cherished? The histories of Sao Luiz do Paraitinga, expressed in the relationships between its families and the spaces of living, sharing, circulation, sociability, and work, became our field of observation. These relationships at this particular point in the town's history include now the remains of the floods and the results of their efforts towards reconstruction. You have here the main church. I think you saw that it fell down, and it's very interesting. This slide, this picture below, they kind of rebuilt the structure in iron of the church exactly as it was, and then you see here other works being reconstructed. They joined all the nails of the church to reuse it for building a new church, some examples of. Our aim is to register the way in which families throughout time, since the moment of the tragedy, reconstruct these spaces and objects, and together with this, their home place and life. The water of the floods tore down what seemed to be solid and sound for them. And our hypothesis is that the present-day situation demands from all a collective process of working through. It's not only about repairing the material traces of a construction, but also about an internal reparation, to be able to reinsert oneself in the environment. It's about an exercise in memory and with memory. And in this endeavor, in our period, not only deserve to be followed up and recorded, as we believe that the recording work itself could act for those implied in it as a tool to mobilize the work of personal reparation. The waters may flood memory. To place oneself in the here and now forces the inhabitants to carry out a risky exercise of remembering and overcoming the remembrances. It's between negation and melancholy that the difficult personal transit of dealing with memory and the meanings of the tragedy takes place. So, in this context, our intention is not merely to collect impressions, but also to foster an elaborative support and record the process in order to think about the limitations and possibilities of the intervention in itself. We began with the hypothesis that rescuing the material traces could help in these elaborations of the inhabitants in formulating a way of living that might integrate memory and tragedy. It was therefore about understanding the relationships of these inhabitants with their spaces and objects based on the meanings they themselves give to their history, their living there. And we wanted to record these relationships based on the mutative views and feelings over time. So I've got to know, not from the beginning, but by this invitation, that it is a longitudinal research as far as it follows the time of mourning and reparation. So this is the time of the project. We invited then at the beginning 5 families to be participants in surveys, mainly families that one of the filmmakers, the one that did this piece, knew, because he lives very near this area, so he has a very particular interest and acquaintance with the town. We invited 5 families, and trying to registering in narratives, but also through photos and a documentary that they would themselves make their spaces of circulation and daily living, taking into account the material marks of what was lost, as well as the efforts toward reconstruction. So as I've tried to say, besides being a documentary record at an extreme moment of a community, it also sets for an intervention strategy, insofar as it emerges as a tool to recompose memories of lost spaces and objects, with the question of what might be the role of this kind of registry, visual and narrative registry, in this process of working through of mourning and reconstruction. Might we, so it's really a social practice in this sense as well. So the proposal is to develop observational documentation, setting for exercises in remembrance through the co-participation in a variety of activities that include recording narratives, images, sounds that represent these objects and spaces, in such a way that it might become possible to reflect upon a set of family strategies that alternate between material and immaterial memory and between losses and reparation. So how, by means of these narratives and images, the immaterialized memories might be revisited, observed, and worked on collectively. So that was our question. In this proposal, so we looked at the possibility of creating an audiovisual memory collection of something that was formerly a common material heritage. So, going quickly on some activities developed on the project, we had some initial meetings with these 5 families to collectively reflect upon the impact of losses and the reparation process going on. Some talks with them. So the families, but we since the beginning we thought that the families that would be engaged in the project might vary throughout the process based on networks, information that they themselves might and are being given. And then there are some workshops with the families, enabling them to technically appropriate of the video and photo cameras in order to have an intentional and reflexive approach towards the production of images. And we have some material on, can you read all? Can you read what? I don't know if I can do it. Well, I brought some material of this image they have already produced. So Nena, an artisan and householder, well, these are already their production. What they did select to photograph. An old book called Wonderful Stories, her mother's armchair. Her mother has died, although in the tragedy nobody died exactly at the moment of the floods. Some people died soon after that. and they themselves related to depression and the losses. Her mother has died soon after. She, in some ways, thinks that it has something to do. Her house was completely destroyed. So, and some of their, it's not easy to see the emptiness and nothing to replace on scenery. And it's herself also. She is taking care of family objects. These were some clay sculptures made by her father, some family china destroyed. This was her father was a very important musician in the town, and then she shows a photograph with her mother with all the instruments behind. And the instruments, this wall was also completely destroyed, and then she has all these instruments in a wardrobe, waiting for some money to try to repair the instruments. This is an architect, and she chose to photograph a little church that was completely rebuilt, and she says the little church rebuilt is better than the old one. He's a poet, he's a very interesting personality. He said that although he lost piles of notebooks with poems and musics of his own, all handwritten, and it was all destroyed, he said, well, I thought that life is beginning again, and I feel like a child now. So he said, I decided to photograph the street parties. I wanted to show you that life is going on. So after the flood, I forgot it, and I want to take some photos. Now I want to take some photos, and it was mainly parties what he decided. So it's very interesting how each one took our invitation to photograph in radical different ways. This man, Pedro, has a restaurant there, cleaning the mud, and then again at the carnival with his family. And he said, elderly people didn't die on tragedy, but so many has died after that depressed. And she's a singer also, and it's very interesting because she and a cousin of hers tattooed on the back, on their back, the house of the family. And she also showed us some photographs of a dress her mother used to use, and now she's using when she sings. And it's also her. And she said, then it was very interesting because she had quite a kind of insight during this work, because she said, I found out that all my memories are related to my grandma, and all the photos she took are from objects of her grandma. Okay. So it's a work in progress, and all this material is meant to be organized collectively with them for an exhibition to be held there in the town and at the University of São Paulo. And we also are working on a documentary film together. They were going to work with us with the script to document the whole process of the research.